Capitalism is unstable, capitalism is unequal, and capitalism is fundamentally undemocratic.
I want people to make their own choices about how they live their lives, the professions they lead, where they want to work, and what they do. And capitalism offers that potential.
Slavery did it with masters and slaves. Feudalism did it with lords and serfs. Capitalism does it with employers and employees.
Capitalism, private property, is necessary, although not sufficient, to a free and open society.
Please come up to the stage, debaters, two young men in the prime of their lives, Richard Wolff, who will be defending the proposition, socialism is preferable to capitalism as an economic system that promotes freedom, equality, and prosperity. Gene Epstein will be taking the negative on that. Each candidate, the way this will work is that each debater will have 17 and a half minutes. In that last 30 seconds, when it comes, you'll understand why it's there. But each of them will have 17 minutes and 30 seconds to lay out an initial case. They'll do 5 minutes each of rebuttal. I'm going to beat them up a little bit with a moderator's prerogative on some questions. Then we're going to open it up to 30 minutes or more of audience Q&A. 5 minutes each of closing statement, 7.5. And again, those 30 seconds. You know, this is where the world changes in those 30 seconds. And then we will take another vote, and we'll see who is the big winner. Jane, could you please, and if you haven't voted yet, you've got about 5 seconds to go. Please make a vote. Either vote for the proposition, against it, or undecided. You need to vote now in order to vote later. And without further ado, let's have Richard Wolff come up and explain to us why socialism is preferable to capitalism as an economic system that promotes freedom, equality, and prosperity. Richard Wolff, you have the stage.
Thank you all for coming. I assume that socialism is the reason that you came, either for it or against it. And I hope that the things I have to say will make some sense of it for you. I did want to comment on the notion that Reason Magazine is free and that the Understanding Marxism book costs money. And I want to urge you not to infer from the price what the values of these things are. That would be a mistake. It would be confusing the price with the value, and for those of you that know something about socialist theory, that's something you want to avoid. Okay. Socialism preferable to capitalism. My basic argument is that's a very low bar. That's not asking much. And I want to make that case as strongly as I know how. But I have a problem in the very beginning, as I always do, traveling around this country, talking about this. And that is, we are like bears in this country, coming out of a hibernation, about 70 years of it. Since 1945, when everything changed, from a society in which socialists, communists, Marxists, occupied all the normal positions in society as teachers and workers and bureaucrats and unionists, when we had a New Deal that celebrated many of the objectives socialists have always supported. Across the United States had a big picture over the wall, the clerk's office where you bought stamps. And there was Uncle Sam with his hat, arm in arm with Uncle Joe, which stood for Joseph Stalin. After that, there was, not so surprisingly, a terrible reaction. The business community and the right wing in America was horrified that for the 1930s, we had had a program of raising taxes on corporations and the rich in order to fund the creation, for the first time in American history, of Social Security, unemployment compensation, the first minimum wage, and a public employment project that hired 15 million people. The rich had to pay, and the mass of the Americans got the benefits. This was so horrific, it freaked out the forerunners of the Koch brothers. And then an alliance with the Soviet Union finished off whoever wasn't freaked out already. And so in 1945, everything had to be undone. The New Deal coalition, for those of you who remember your history, socialists, communists, the CIO unions representing tens of millions of American workers, they're the ones that made all that happen. They're the ones that made Roosevelt do all those things. And they had to be defeated, and they were. And the way you break up a coalition is you find the weakest link, or what you can make out to be the weakest link, and suddenly communists and socialists who had been the militants making the 1930s the greatest unionization period in American history. We never had anything like it before. We've never had anything like it since. Communists had to be transformed, and likewise socialists. From the great allies in the war, from the great vanguard of social programs in the 30s, they became agents of a foreign power likely to be interested in strangling your cat. And they had to be driven out of the unions, the 1947 Taft-Hartley, driven out of their teaching jobs, driven out of the consciousness of the American people, who were terrorized about being interested in those things, as they have mostly been in the last 40, 50, 60, 70 years. A personal note. When I went to college as a young person, I was interested in learning about Marxism, and I asked my teachers in the university, what course can I take to learn about Marxism? Half my teachers explained to me there isn't any, nobody here knows anything about it. The other half said, oh, yeah, we know about it, but we're way too scared. We're not going to teach you anything about it. In my undergraduate and my graduate years, and I majored in economics, I'm an economics professor, here's a fact. No one ever in any economics course assigned me one word of Karl Marx. Is that because he had nothing to teach us? Don't be silly. They were just afraid. 75 years of fear. There's nothing smart and nothing excusable in any of that. Oh, and let me mention, since it might be of some interest to you, the three schools I attended were Harvard, Stanford, and Yale. And if they don't have the courage, what can you expect from Eastern Kentucky? So I have a problem to talk to you about socialism, because unless you're a very unusual American, and there are some, or a foreigner, because the situation's different abroad, you don't know much about socialism, or what you do know is 75 years out of date, because it's changed a lot, as I'm going to point out to you as I go through the argument. Okay, let's do it. Socialists disagree. They always have, from the beginning. Socialism is a product of capitalism. It always was. There was no socialism before capitalism came into being. Why? Because capitalism in the French and American revolutions made a big fat promise when it asked people to leave the feudalism that existed before and shift over to capitalism. It made the promise, as in the French Revolution, that capitalism would bring with it liberty, equality, fraternity, and let's add democracy and prosperity. Socialism is the movement that recognizes that what capitalism promised, liberty, equality, fraternity, and democracy, wasn't delivered and never was. And the socialism is a movement which, if it has anything in common among its different tendencies, is a notion that we can do better than capitalism. It's a yearning to do better. It's the kind of yearning slaves had to go beyond slavery, or serfs to go beyond feudalism. Employees and the people who empathize with them figure we can go better and do better than capitalism. That's what socialism is. Beyond that, socialists agree about three flaws, failures of capitalism. And again, briefly, to go through them. But there are three. Capitalism is unstable. Capitalism is unequal. And capitalism is fundamentally undemocratic. Let me briefly explain. Unstable. Every 4 to 7 years in every capitalist country, on average, there's an economic downturn, not due to nature and not due to war, just built into the system. It's called the business cycle because it always comes back. Millions of people lose work, businesses go out of business, a crazy crash. You know what it's like. If you pick up the financial press, you'll know we're waiting for the next one to hit this year or next. Mr. Trump's biggest worry about being reelected is that it'll happen too soon. He worries, as we all do. It's an unstable system. That's crazy to live in an unstable system. If you live with a roommate as unstable as capitalism, you would have moved out long ago. What an amazing thing to accept a system that every 4 to 7 years threatens millions of people with unemployment, lost income, interrupted vacation, interrupted education, lost mortgage, you name it. Then let's do the next one, inequality. Oxfam in England keeps track of these things. And the latest number from them summarizes it all. The 80 or 90 richest people in the United States together, in the world, have more wealth than the bottom half of the population, 3.5 billion people. That's the achievement of capitalism, that kind of distribution. If you took away half the wealth of those 80 to 100 people, guess what? They'd still be the richest people in the world, only you'd now have a vast amount of money to deal with the sickness, the lack of education, the absence of water, the insufficiency of food of the vast majority of people. What an achievement, such inequality. And now finally, the lack of democracy. The part of it you probably know and thought about is the buying of our political process. On display every day, everywhere. You all see it, you all know it. But here's a part of the lack of democracy you might not have thought about. Long ago, we got rid of kings, queens. We decided we didn't need somebody sitting at the top of society telling us all what to do so that we would all be, let's call it subjects. That's what they called us. So we got rid of the kings and queens, and we said, no, we can run this in a different way, this political system. We can all get together, we can periodically vote and take steps and collectively make the decisions that used to be in the hands of the kings and the queens. How interesting. We democratized, at least a little, the politics. And what we didn't do was to democratize the economics. So what do we have inside each enterprise? A little king, an owner, a manager, a board of directors, a king and his court, who run everything, who make all the key decisions, what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits everybody in the enterprise helps to produce. If it's too difficult for you to hear me out, then it's a sign that I'm getting to you.
Thanks. We're good. Please, keep going.
Please hear out Professor Wolf. Please respect Professor Wolf.
We don't have democracy in our workplaces. We never did. The commitment to democracy is verbal in this society, limited to that voting activity where we live, but not where we work. And as adults, that's where we spend most of our time. going to work, being at work, and recuperating from work. In the workplace, no democracy at all. We do what we're told. What we produce belongs to somebody else, and we have no say over what they do with it, how this is organized, what the technology is. And socialists, therefore, have said, my God, we can do better than capitalism, and that's what they want. And that's what they agree on, but here's where the disagreements. How do you go about it? What do you do? And we have a benefit, socialists do today. We have some experiments that were made in the 20th century, Russia, China, Cuba, and so on. And we learned from those experiments what works and what doesn't, what should be pursued and what should be set aside. And so the new socialism, and if you're not aware of it, that has to go back to what I said at the beginning. You haven't been keeping up, which is hard to do in a society which makes socialism a taboo. What has happened to socialism is a refocusing of itself. It's not interested so much in the state doing things that achieved rapid rates of economic growth, true enough, but it also left too much power in the hands of too few people, and that has to be addressed and dealt with, which socialists have been doing. And the new focus of socialism is to do something at the workplace that was never done, to go beyond capitalism in the organization of the workplace, to democratize the workplace, to make where we spend most of our adult lives at work a place where democracy reigns, where all the people who work in an enterprise participate in making the decisions of what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits. Because if they all together made those decisions, we wouldn't give some people $150 billion and other people have to borrow money to get their kid through college. We wouldn't have the inequality. We certainly wouldn't allow the irrationality of every 4 to 7 year instability. Everybody together would choose a technology that isn't dangerous to the health of all of us at the workplace. We could go beyond capitalism, but we have to have the courage to do what was not yet done, not in Roosevelt's New Deal and not in Russia or China either. The transformation at the base of society into a democratized workplace. That's the new direction of socialism. That's where socialism will be in the 21st century that we are now entering. It's a new and a different socialism. It has learned from its own earlier experiences and experiments. 2 little footnotes. Capitalism did not emerge out of feudalism all finished in one swell swoop, did it? If you know the history, you'll know that capitalism started in this town, in that village, in that area. Often it didn't last more than a few weeks or a few months, sometimes a few years, and then it was crushed by feudalism. And they had to figure out how to survive, and they had to get together. It took centuries. Socialism isn't born all at once either. It makes its early experiments. It had one in the Paris Commune in 1870, and then it had some other experiments in the 20th century that I've mentioned. And just like with capitalism, you learn from your experiments how to make it better next time, how to correct the mistakes you made in the project that has animated socialists from the beginning. We can do better than capitalism, and there is no reason that the human progress that took us beyond ancient villages and tribes and slavery and feudalism should imagine itself to have stopped at this point. Every other system was born, evolved, and died. Capitalism, we know, was born and evolved. I'll leave it to your inference as to what it is doing now. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Richard Wolff. Follow him on Twitter at at Richard D. Wolff with 2 Fs. And now, taking the opposite side is Gene Epstein. Follow him at Gene Soho Forum. Gene Epstein, ladies and gentlemen.
By the way, there are seats up front for people who are in the back, and I want to apologize to Professor Wolff for that outburst. That was very rude. We don't run the Soho Forum that way. And thank you, for Professor Wolff, for being gracious about that. Well, let me start. It is a pleasure to share a stage with Richard Wolff, who I consider my alter ego in a parallel universe. We both came of age as socialists. In my case, from age 1, since my mother was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party, and I have her FBI file to prove it. You could always tell who the FBI agents were in the party because they were the only ones who paid their dues on time. Richard paid his dues by getting an economics PhD at Yale, followed by a career advocating socialism. I paid my dues by evolving into a different kind of radical, a bleeding heart, freedom-loving advocate of capitalism. I believe that even the deeply flawed capitalism we have now, heavily distorted by government interference on behalf of the powerful, is preferable by far to Richard's socialism in promoting freedom, prosperity, and equality. Richard bears a very heavy burden of proof because his socialism has never existed. He repudiates my mother's Soviet Union, my mother's favorite Cuba. He has indeed called these systems state capitalist. I'm glad he's learned from their mistakes, since their mistakes has in fact, of course, cost the blood of tens of millions of innocent people. He wants the economy, as he explains in his book, Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism. He wants the economy reorganized around workers' self-directed enterprises in which employees own and democratically run companies and keep the broadly defined profits or surplus that normally go to the employers. I fully support what Richard calls employees becoming their own employers, so long as people freely choose that arrangement. Richard thinks such firms are a substitute for capitalism, but they're actually just another option that capitalism offers. Nothing about the system of protecting property rights of firms in a free market dictates how these firms must be structured. Richard himself has written about the, quote, varying kinds and degrees of democracy in the workplace which already exist. Based on these cases, he observes, quote, workplace democracy responds to deep needs and desires, unquote. But these deep needs and desires seem to run only skin deep. Richard has written that in today's worker-owned enterprises, quote, it might be legally possible for worker owners to transform the enterprise so that they become not only owners, but also collectively directors. However, he concedes, that has very rarely happened. Well, no doubt it very rarely happens because workers very rarely want it to happen. But the move to workers' self-directed enterprises can happen in the capitalist system if workers do want it to happen. Start with the fact that the bottom half of the population accounts for 1/3 of all consumer spending, the bottom 4/5 for nearly 2/3, adding up to trillions of dollars per year. On the investment side, there's over $1 trillion in labor union pension funds domestically and an estimated $40 trillion worldwide held by labor union pension funds. All this financial firepower could be marshaled to make workers' self-directed enterprises the dominant mode of production. And it would be true to the 1960s view that radical change must be implemented by the same people who seek to be the embodiment of that radical change. But the unwillingness of workers to follow the Marxist playbook is as old as Marxism itself. Around 1980, democratic socialists like Michael Harrington and Tom Hayden advocated a bottom-up socialism similar to Richard's. But they acknowledge that without the coercive power of government, worker-owned enterprises, quote, are almost impossible to get off the ground, as two of them wrote. Richard might argue that it's okay to use government power to try to jumpstart workers' self-directed firms, since government often rigs the game anyway. But a Marxist like Richard should be deeply troubled by the old contradiction of radical change from below being implemented by the force of government from above. And beyond that, he would use government to socialize finance and the allocation of labor. That's why he and I are taking opposite sides in this debate. He advocates a full-blown form of socialism that will put freedom, prosperity, and equality under siege, just like the old socialisms did. But let's go all the way with Richard and assume that a socialist political party wins at the ballot box with 2/3 of the electorate voting for its candidates. Since 2/3 is normally interpreted in politics as a mandate, the government makes Richard's socialism a reality. But voting for a radical idea in a voting booth is very different from a full and active commitment to that idea. So let's not assume that the 2/3 have anticipated the real consequences of what they voted for. Richard writes that apart from doing our assigned jobs, workers would each be, quote, democratically and collectively given fully equal participation in decision-making over their own enterprise and over the broad economy, unquote. He adds, somewhat ominously, quote, no one could work without engaging in both roles. There will be a need for financing under Richard's socialism, both to create new worker-owned companies and to provide funds for enterprises that want to expand. The, quote, obvious alternative, writes Richard, to the existing sources of finance is, quote, socialized banking, consisting of, quote, workers' self-directed enterprises where workers and communities affected by bank policies together direct and operate banks. So Richard would shut down the nearly $50 billion raised annually through crowdfunding and the several hundred billion raised through various forms of venture capital. And finance is not the only function he would relegate to the power of politics. He also proposes a, quote, specialized agency that would, quote, always know from constant monitoring which existing enterprises need more laborers, which have registered the wish to commence new production, all the relevant skill and experience requirements, and where affected laborers and enterprises are located, unquote. He adds that the agency's reports would be submitted to all workers to aid them in making their decisions. Notice that he's talking about knowledge of the relevant skill and experience of 160 million workers in the U.S. across hundreds of thousands of firms. That's information the specialized agency will, quote, always know from constant monitoring. From my work experience, I can tell Richard that those constant monitors who keep coming around will be the butt of jokes, and the information they come away with will be superficial when it isn't totally misleading. So in Richard's world, we'll be required to do our assigned jobs, attend meetings about company matters, and vote on the outcomes. We'll also have to pore over the reports of the labor allocation financial agencies and then discuss their recommendations with many others and vote on those outcomes. I submit that only in a dystopian nightmare could most of us imagine ourselves spending our waking hours in this way, especially since the vote of any one of us, can hardly determine the outcome anyway. Richard approvingly uses the 1960s term participatory democracy, in which we each get to participate actively in democratic decision-making. In a 1970 book called After the Revolution, sociologist Robert Dahl explained the arithmetical unworkability of this idea. If each attendee at a meeting were given just 10 minutes to address the issue being voted on, it would take 10 hours to move on to the next issue, provided there were only 60 people at the meeting. But let's take this leap and assume the participatory democracy would be functional. Many firms seeking to expand their operations will have to borrow funds from the democratically run financial agencies, while also applying to the democratically run labor allocation agency for more workers. And these democratically run agencies will be ruled by the vote of the majority. But to pick up on an objection raised by Atlantic Magazine journalist Connor Friedersdorf, we might ask, how easy will it be to get the democratically run finance and labor allocation agencies to support the expansion plans of firms that produce Muslim prayer rugs and Korans and the building of new mosques? Friedersdorf goes on to ask, would you prefer a socialist society in which birth control is available if and only if a majority of workers exercising their democratic control assents? Or would you prefer a society in which private business